So, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us to this Luisa Roldán discussion and book launch. My name is Victoria Benjamin, and I'm Publicity Manager at Lund Humphries. Today's discussion marks the publication of Luisa Roldán by Catherine Hall van den Elsen. It's co-published by Lund Humphries and Getty Publications. This beautifully illustrated book presents the first overview in English of the life and work of Luisa Roldán, the prolific and celebrated sculptor of the Spanish Golden Age. The book was published in September, and it's replete with invaluable insights into Roldán's artistic achievements, and it also includes a list of all known extant works by the artist. Luisa Roldán is the inaugural volume in the new series of books called the Illuminating Women Artists series. This series is the first to focus in a deliberate and sustained way on women artists throughout history, to recognize their accomplishments, to revive their name recognition, and to make their works better known to art enthusiasts of the 21st century. Many of the women represented by the volumes are celebrated professional artists in their own eras, yet their names and work have not been passed down continually in the history of art. As the first series dedicated to correcting this omission, the books interweave established conclusions with new discoveries to reframe how women's artistic production is approached and understood. The next in the series will be a volume featuring the Italian Baroque painter Artemisia Gentileschi by Sheila Barker. This one's due out in February 2022. Other volumes coming up in the series include Barbara Longhi by Liana Cini, Plautella Nelli by Catherine Turil-Lupi, Rachel Reusch by Marianne Berardi, and Judith Lester by Freema Fox Hofrichter. If you'd like to hear more about the future volumes in the series, please visit the Lund Humphries Illuminating Women Artists series page on the website and sign up for updates. To celebrate the launch of Luisa Roldán, both Getty Publications and Lund Humphries are offering 20% off the normal book price until the end of October. We've set up the special code offer, Women Artist 20, that you can see on the screen here, and it will be used on both publishers' websites. So please, depending on where you live, go to getty.org/publications, or for the rest of the world, visit lundhumphries.com to buy your copy at this special price. Now let me introduce our two speakers today. Catherine Hall van den Elsen studied Spanish art at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. In 2018, Hall published a monograph on Luisa Roldán in Spanish, and in 2020, an annotated bibliography in the Oxford Bibliographies in Art History series. She has contributed book chapters to Roldana in 2007, Women Artists in the Courts of Europe, coming up in 2021, and Polychromy in the Early Modern World, 1200 to 1800. This is anticipated in 2022 via Routledge. We're also delighted to welcome Holly Trusted, who's joining the discussion today. Dr. Holly Trusted, formerly known as Marjorie Trusted, is a graduate of Cambridge University and the Courtauld Institute of Art, and she's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. A senior honorary research fellow at the Victoria and Albert Museum, she was previously senior curator of sculpture at the V&A. She is also a senior research fellow of the University of Glasgow. She is co-founder and trustee of ARTES, Iberian and Latin American Visual Culture Group. She is also a co-founder and currently co-chair of the Public Statues and Sculpture Association and founding editor of the Sculpture Journal. She has lectured and published widely on sculpture. Her publications include British Sculpture 1470 to 2000, The Arts of Spain, Iberia, and Latin America 1450 to 1700, The Making of Sculpture, Baroque and Later Ivories, and The Cast Courts. She is currently preparing a book on German Baroque sculpture to be published in 2022. So I'm delighted to hand over to Holly and Kathy. But first, let me point out that we'll be keen to take as many questions as we can at the end of the discussion. Please feel free to type in your questions via the Q&A function throughout the talk, and we'll get through those at the end. Let's start out now by asking Holly and Kathy, how did you first get to know the work of Luisa Roldán?
Okay, well, thank you, Victoria. I'll go first and say that I first encountered Luisa as an undergraduate Spanish student when a guest lecturer came to talk about Golden Age Spanish art. And it was a class of basically Spanish literature students. But this lecturer showed us slides of paintings by El Greco and Velázquez and Murillo and Zurbarán, and sculptures by Martínez Montañez and Pedro Roldán, and a relatively unknown woman called Luisa Roldán. And when he mentioned her name, he showed an image of what's now known as the ecstasy of the Magdalene, which then was known as the death of the Magdalene. And somehow something resonated with me in that image, and it stayed with me for the rest of my undergraduate studies and my honours year. And then when I started to consider a master's degree, Luisa Roldán was pretty much the only topic I was really interested in at all, specifically because of how difficult I knew it would be to find out what I wanted to find out about her. So it was the beginning of a very long journey.
It's very interesting hearing you talk, Kathy, because I know your long journey involved looking at archives, obviously looking at many sculptures, looking very closely at them. But my journey was somewhat different because I was a museum curator, and I had the good fortune that in the Victoria and Albert Museum we had and have a very good collection of Spanish sculpture, very interesting collection. And I came to Luisa Roldán via that collection because we're lucky enough to have a terracotta group by Luisa Roldán that we'll see later on. I managed to write a catalogue of the Spanish sculpture in 1996. Actually, I felt at the time, and I still feel, we had the object, which was marvelous, and I went to Spain many times and talked with many very helpful colleagues, not least Kathy herself. But I didn't have the depth of primary research that Kathy has done. She's really looked very closely at the documentation and what that tells us about the story of Luisa. One thing that we were able to do, as I was able to do as a museum curator, was look at the context from which Luisa came. So looking at sculpture in Spain and specifically Andalusia, Seville, and why that sculpture has a very different feel from the sculpture of, say, Italy or France. It's not usually classical, it's usually made of wood.
We might jump to the next slide now,
yes,
Victoria,
let's do that.
as an illustration.
Yes, of course.
Oh no, not that one. Yes, that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, that's a very good one because that's very much, if you like, typifies what the sort of characteristics that you can associate with Spain. It's very emotional. It's coloured. It's very realistic. It's obviously very religious, and the church was the most important patron of sculpture. Obviously, the Habsburgs were also important patrons, but this kind of sculpture that we're seeing on the screen now is very typical of the sculptures that were displayed and valued and cherished in the churches. Spain was a very rich country from the late 15th century up to the late 17th century. Many artists from abroad came to find work there. And for that reason, very interestingly, some of the characteristics we we see as Spanish, you could probably trace back to the Netherlands. So the colour, the gilding in many cases, the estofado, which is the wonderful way that textiles were conveyed through painting, that actually ultimately probably derived from the Netherlands. But nevertheless, all these foreign traditions, which were, there was a confluence of traditions in Spain. Spanish art, Spanish sculpture has a very, very specific sort of character, which is very distinctive and very recognizable, intense religious feeling, lots of drama, often very life-size figures with an overpowering presence. Marble or bronze was generally imported from Italy rather than being produced locally. So the material of choice was wood, and as we'll see, terracotta. That's also another important material in Spain. But it is, this is the world that Luisa inhabited. This is the world that she comes from, and how she used those, if you like, those ways of conveying figurative scenes is absolutely crucial to understanding what she was about. So I'll hand back to Kathy now, because Kathy's now going to, I think, tell us a little bit about her life.
Yes, thanks, Holly. That was great. A really useful introduction. So Luisa was born in 1652. She was the daughter of the renowned Sevillian sculptor Pedro Roldán. And Pedro was part of a really close community of artists and artisans, sculptors, gilders, designers, people who made the kind of the furniture of the altarpiece. And he had a large studio, and he was continually contributing to the religious environment of Seville. So he had a large workshop that had quite a few apprentices, but for about the first 12 years of his life as a young married man, he didn't have a son. Shock, horror. So who was he going to leave the workshop to? So rather than having a son, he actually, the first few children he had, and he did have many, were girls. And I think it's probably for this reason that he allowed the girls into his workshop to work alongside apprentices, not necessarily doing major pieces of art, but helping. And over time, his second daughter, Luisa, started to show significant promise, and she basically would have trained alongside the apprentices, formally trained alongside the apprentices. The one disadvantage that she had was that she couldn't go to the art academy to do life drawing in the evenings like her father and brothers later did, because she was female, and life drawing, as you can imagine, was not permitted. But she later demonstrates in her work a very good understanding of human anatomy. So it's clear that she got her training from somewhere. It wasn't in the academy. It's very likely to have been in her father's large workshop. So life with Pedro in this very big, demanding, messy, noisy workshop probably wasn't all that easy. He's described by Palomino, who curiously is a friend of Luisa's, as a solitary man, given to bearing grudges, or rather not letting grudges go very easily. So that gives us, we have very few real hints about her life, but that little observation gives us some possibility of understanding why when she was 19, she walked out the door of the family home, knocked on the Archbishop's palace door and said, "Hey, I'd like to marry Luis Antonio de los Arcos," which she was within her rights to do. But even though she was within her rights to do it, it was still a fairly rebellious thing for a 19-year-old single woman to do. So Pedro withheld consent for 4 of his daughters to marry men of their choosing, but Luisa was the first who actually kind of confronted him and said, "No, this isn't okay. I'm going to marry that guy." And what we're very lucky to have is the documentation of the interview that was done by the ecclesiastical authorities and Luisa, and the same authorities and Luis Antonio, and with 2 witnesses. And at one stage in her interview, they say something along the lines of, would you like someone to be with you when you're making your statement? And she said, "No, I'm perfectly within my rights to make this statement. I know what I want, and I don't see why I should have anyone next to me when I explain my situation." And you kind of think, whoa, this is 1671. This is forthright. This is fearless. And this fearlessness, I think, characterizes much of the rest of her life. So she did leave the family home. She moved in with her husband's family, with whom she lived for another 10 years. And she had multiple children and started work in company with her husband. In company with her husband is a phrase that she uses in one of the documents. So I'm going to show you a slide in a minute, but first of all, I want to explain a little bit of the context. Her earliest really significant commission is a Holy Week float from 1677. So Holy Week is a very, very big week in Seville, as it was 350 years ago. And the Brotherhoods, who were charitable organizations, usually organized around a church and a chapel with a particular devotion to an image of the Virgin Mary or the Christ, a Christ figure or a significant saint. And the Brotherhoods would commission works of art, would commission sculptures to be processed through the narrow streets of Seville to demonstrate their devotion to the particular image that was being paraded through the streets. So the commissions were really, really explicitly written. The contracts, rather, were really explicitly written. So the float needs to be just wide enough to go down a particular street. It needs to be a little bit bigger than the Brotherhood next door. It needs to have wood of a particular quality for the faces. It needs to be, a sculpture might need to be entirely in wood, or it might just need to be on a frame made to be dressed, as this Our Lady of Solitude is. What we have here is a face and just the upper chest and hands, and the rest that you can't see is basically quite a crude frame. But that's all the Brotherhood wanted. Perhaps that's all the Brotherhood could afford because they saved up for a very long time to pay the sculptors to create these works. So when she was growing up, many of the floats were single figures, and were just carried to the cathedral and back in a journey of many, many hours. But in 1677, when Luisa and her husband, Luis Antonio, were only 25, they were commissioned to do the work that we see here. And the image that you'll see here is that the work in the very same street that it would have processed down 350 years ago. So Victoria, if we might see the next image. Okay, so you can see how striking it is even now for us. But in 1677, there were very, very, very few. In fact, I would argue this is among the first 5 that were multiple figures, multiple relationships created between the figures. So some are looking at the crucified cross, the crucified Christ. Some are looking at each other. The 2 men at the back are getting ready to climb up on their ladders to bring down the Christ figure. St. John the Evangelist there is looking at the Virgin Mary in her grief. So there's a whole lot going on. And for the people of 1677, this would have been an amazingly striking piece of a striking experience, if you like. So rather than just a series of sculptures on a float going down a street, this is a mystery of the Passion of Christ, and the float rests in its chapel for a couple of weeks before it's ready to come out into the street, so that the people walk around and around and study the images and look at the attitudes and look at how the people are relating to each other. So it's a very, very powerful image. So if we go to the next slide, Victoria, thank you, we can see these are 2 of the works from that float. We have St. John the Evangelist and St. Joseph of Arimathea. And you can see the quality of the sculpture. So even though they're a distance from the viewing public in that they're sort of up high, the quality of the work really didn't suffer at all. And if we have a look at the next work, we can, the next slide please, Victoria, we can see this is the following year. So they wouldn't have finished this, the previous work, when they got this commission, which is similar in that it's got multiple figures in it, but there's much more actual movement. And instead of having most of the figures clothed, many of these figures are unclothed and have short-sleeved tops and short robes on, so their legs and their forearms are sculpted, are fully sculpted. So you can also, I thought this slide was particularly good because it shows how significant a piece of work the floats were. So you've got the main story on the top, and then in the center of the, I wonder, can you see this, me wiggling this? No? No, no, okay. So underneath the float, you can see there's a little medallion there, which is a low relief sculpture. And there are 8 of them around the edges of the float. So they actually tell the story of the lead up to this particular moment, which is also reflected in the 4 angels of carrying the instruments of passion on the 4 corners. So we've got one angel carrying nails, another carrying a crown of thorns, another carrying hammers, or a single hammer, and another carrying pincers to remove the nails after Christ's death. So the figures are roughly life-size, and you can just imagine 26-year-olds getting this commission on top of the commission they got the previous year. They were very obviously, well, to my way of thinking, they were very obviously on the way up, you know, very well regarded to get these 2 commissions. And it looks as though they had really started to make names for themselves, despite the fact that they were probably not attached to Pedro Roldan's studio. There's still the possibility that they reconciled because Pedro had a really busy studio around this decade, and Luisa had 4 children in about 8 years, so she would have been kind of busy. But it is possible that Pedro asked her back or asked them back, and that they were able to do some work together. But in any case, these 2 floats really announce them as figures on the way up, as important sculptors. So instead of staying in Seville, perhaps in competition with her father, they turned their attention to a new market in the growing coastal city of Cadiz, which is right on the Atlantic. It's an hour and a half on a fast train now, but then it was a day away by boat on the Guadalquivir River, or more than 2 days if they went by horseback. So let's have a look at the next slide and we'll see what they were up to in Cadiz. Okay, so this work is the Essai en mots, and it's a little less than life-size, and it's obviously the figure of Christ holding the stick that they gave him to represent a scepter, and the crown of thorns that they gave him to represent his crown as king. It's a very, very vivid image to stand next to. There's a sense of communication that is conveyed through his gaze and his open mouth. the open mouth with the upper teeth very clearly defined, and the slightly protruding lower lip is a characteristic of many of her works. And the same with that, the curling ringlets of hair around his shoulder is also something that you see again and again in images of the Christ figure, and even in the St. Joseph of the previous slide also has hair like that. The other thing that's particularly striking about this image is the amount of strain that is conveyed by the veins that are just a couple of millimeters above the surface of the rest of the body, and the protruding collarbone as well. You see the veins protruding as well in his hands and his arms as well. So he's a very, very human Christ who's under immense physical and clearly emotional strain at this time. And I think this has been conveyed very, very beautifully. The authorship of this work wasn't discovered until, it was known in its day, obviously, but until about 1984, when it was being restored, and the restorer, as one does when one restores images like this, removed part of the head because it's put together by nails or little pieces of dowel that attach the head to a frame. And upon removing the head, the part of the head, he found a piece of paper in it, lodged inside the head, that said, Luisa Roldán, in company with her husband, Luis Antonio de los Arcos, did this work for the glory of God. So once again, this is another signal of a young woman who was going places, but at the same time, she was also continuing to have children. She lost quite a few, but she kept on reproducing. So she was a very, very busy woman, as well as being phenomenally talented woman. And you, just for your information, the eyes there are pieces of painted glass that are inserted through the back of the head. And you can't see the joins because of the quality of the paintwork and the preparation that have been done by the polychromer, who in this instance would have been her brother-in-law, Luis Antonio's brother. So let's look at the next slide and we'll see what else she got up to in Cadiz. In these around about 4 years, she was particularly busy in Cadiz. My perspective is that the rental documents that we have that state that she was in Seville during this time are likely to be accurate, and that she or her husband would have travelled by boat down to Cadiz to deliver works or perhaps to negotiate contracts. Let's look at the image in the middle is St. Francis of Assisi, and you can see the estofado that Holly was talking about, the incredible drapery. This is a work entirely made of wood, and the figure on the right is the Virgin of Solitude that we saw on the cover of the book. And this is an image made to be dressed, as I discussed earlier. So we've just got the head and hands of this image. And then the image on the left, I think, is particularly interesting. because it shows that the glass eyes, for example, need a bit of a clean, but it just shows you the fact that this is what the glass eyes look like after 350 years without having been restored. And the other fabulous aspect of this image is that it shows the carving of the curves in the saint's neck and the way that the front of the face is attached to the sides of the face. And of course, when this is ultimately restored, which I hope it will be soon, a lot of that will disappear and it will become as polished as the St. Francis of Assisi in the middle, or the Our Lady of Solitude on the right-hand side. But I think this is great because it just shows you with what economy and with what care these pieces were put together. So the image of Our Lady of Solitude is a phenomenally beautiful work, very, very accessible. Like the others, she's got her slightly protruding lower lip. She's got the teeth showing under the upper lip. And like the Esse Homo that we saw in the previous slide, there's a great desire to communicate with the viewer. And this work, the Our Lady of Solitude, was donated to this same brotherhood in Puerto Real, which is a little village outside Cadiz, about 10 minutes on the train if you want to go and see it. And it was donated by Luisa and Luis Antonio in exchange for prayers to be said for their souls. And you think, okay, so they're now flying. They've got these beautiful floats behind them in Seville. They're doing this phenomenal work with the Esse Homo. They've got how can we say it? They've got a model for communicating fresh-faced, youthful images of saints, and communication was what saints were all about in those days. That was their purpose. You would think once again, okay, she's definitely made it this time. She's done absolutely gorgeous work. She's well recognized. The Brotherhood was incredibly grateful for the donation. Let's just rest on our laurels and stay and produce work in southern Spain because there's clearly a market. So you'd think, yeah, that makes sense, but very little about Luisa makes obvious logic. And the next documentation we have is the baptism 7 months later of a baby girl in Madrid, in the capital, the seat of the Spanish court. And you think, what's she doing there? She's got nothing to do with Madrid. Why is she in Madrid? So moving to Madrid meant a complete break with her family, which may have been what she was looking for, but that's only conjecture on my part. It may have been prompted by the encouragement of a patron or a potential patron called Cristobal de Ontañón, who was very encouraging, and he was a great fan of the Italian painter Luca Giordano, and he was a great fan of the Spanish painter Claudio Coello, but he did get into financial trouble. So it may be that he was very encouraging, but he wasn't able to offer her too much in the way of financial support. All of that is conjecture. We know there's a reference to her and a relationship of some kind with the patron Cristóbal de Ontañón. That's the extent of it. So once they got to Madrid, you would think they'd be cruising because of their fabulous, the fabulous work that they'd left behind in Andalusia. But they actually had to start again. They had to start networking. They had to look at current themes in Madrid, which were quite different to Seville. They had to look at the market for this sculpture. So there weren't all that many new churches being built when they got there. So that would have been an obvious place to go to look for work. However, that didn't happen. We've got a reference to the house they lived in when they arrived, because that's the address they gave when they baptized their baby daughter. But really, that the whole purpose of the trip and then what they did remains a bit of a mystery. So the first signed and dated work is from 1691. And you would think, okay, it's probably a bit like one of these. Well, let's have a look, Victoria, and we'll see what she presented in 1691. So this is the rest on the flight into Egypt. It's made of terracotta. It's signed and dated 1691. As I said, you can see in the front there, Doña Luisa Roldán, Faciebat, 1691. And what we have here is a complete departure from the work that we know and love from southern Spain. It's around 50 centimetres by 50 centimetres, so relatively small. We've got the Holy Family seated in front of a pomegranate tree. There's a goat behind St. Joseph's head, which you can't see, unfortunately, and there's an ass behind the angel's head on the left that you can kind of make out, but you can't see very well. I wish there was such a thing as 3D photographs that we could zoom around the whole thing and see it. And we've got a beautiful St. Joseph with very similar tresses to the St. Joseph's that we saw and the Essioma that we saw in southern Spain. And he's presenting the Christ child with probably a little date. And the angel here has just flown in with some dates for the Christ child to eat. And you think, well, yes, so far so normal, a little rest on the flight into Egypt. But when you actually look at it, if you skip over the fact that one of these poor little putti has lost his head, there's an owl in the tree directly above the Virgin Mary. We've got 3 other very small birds that are all looking at the owl. We've got down the bottom, you can see in the detail, we've got some saddlebags. On the right of the saddlebags, our right, there's a little porcupine just in front of a couple of pomegranates. We've got a little dog, symbol of fidelity, of course. We've got the sheep who's opposing the goat who's on the behind St. Joseph, of course. We've got a little rabbit nibbling on some irises that are symbols of the Virgin Mary. So this is a really, really complicated interrogation of the concept of the conflict between good and evil. We've got, good birds and an evil bird, and we've got the evil porcupine and the faithful dog, and the lustful rabbit. So there's all kinds of stuff going on in this, and it's really interesting to think that this is one of the earliest works that she would have done when she got to Madrid, such a long way away from the work that we knew in southern Spain. What I think is also interesting is about this is the different methods of construction, of course, between the wood that we knew in southern Spain and the terracotta. So I might ask Holly to tell us a little bit about the construction of this and the next work.
And the next one. Well, thank you, Kathy. Gosh, you've given us so much already. So I'm now just going to go off on to the next stage, really, in Luisa's career. If we could have the next slide, Victoria. So this is familiar to maybe some of you, the little group at the V&A, which we acquired back in 1864. It's terracotta. You can see, just like the previous one, it's got a very elaborate wood base. And you can also see that the figures, the angels and the cherubim, are very similar to each other, and indeed similar to other terracottas by Luisa. And undeniably, carving wood sculpture is a different sculptural technique from modeling terracotta, modeling the clay. Whether Luisa or her workshop also used molds so that they could do replicas or at least adaptations of existing figures, heads and so on, they could then reuse again, remains uncertain. But she was obviously producing these wonderful little works. They're small, as you can see from the measurements and from what Kathy has said there. They're basically relatively domestic. And although they would have been made for, we can assume, rather wealthy patrons, they have a very different feel from the large processional figures, the large figures on altarpieces. They're very much intimate. I think I'm right in saying they're all New Testament scenes. They're often, they're not always, the Virgin and Child, and they're very much, you could almost say, not that we want to be too strict about this, that they're more feminine, as opposed to the rather masculine wood figures that she did. The color, obviously, the color was, it wasn't fired. The color was painted on, so it isn't like a ceramic in that sense. But they are very beautiful little works, and it's no coincidence that many of them are in collections, private collections or museums outside Spain, and partly because they were portable, because they weren't installed in a chapel or a church where they, would be kept and continue to be looked at and even prayed to. That these were much more for a different kind of interior space, and they are very, very attractive pieces. They show a completely different side to Luisa's art from what we have known about her until now. And it may well be, as Kathy was saying, that with the move to Madrid, she was trying to, if you like, drum up a different audience, trying to sell her works in a different way. And this was a very novel way. There were predecessors. This isn't entirely innovatory, but it's certainly setting a new trend, and certainly became very much the kind of work that perhaps in the 18th century was going to be much more in vogue. This is a fascinating side to Luisa's work. Yeah, so
I'll just interrupt here and say that Morelli was a sculptor who worked in the palace a couple of decades before Luisa, and we don't know much of what he did. I know that there's one of his works in the Prado, perhaps not on display. But yes, that may have been.
But it
something
was
that
it wasn't a kind of common type of sculpture in
No.
in the 1690s. Can
Yeah.
we go to the next slide, please? I realize I can see the time pressing on. Now, having said that Luisa turned to terracotta, this marvelous work actually dates from the 1690s. It is signed and dated, although the date, unfortunately, has been slightly damaged. So it's 1690 something. We don't know what the final figure is, but clearly after she had gone to Madrid. And it's a full-scale, life-size figure of San Ginés de la Jara. It's at the Getty. It was acquired only, I think, in the 1980s. It's a very astoundingly interesting and important work. And in fact, miraculously, the gilding and polychromy seem all to be original. You can see the glass eyes that we've seen in other works by Luisa. If we go to the next slide, you can see these the details of the hands, and you can see this marvelous realism in the veins, in the polychromy, the anatomy. These are this is a really stunning work, and although perhaps generally speaking, you know, we all know there's lots and lots of wood sculpture in Spain, but as I'm sure many in the audience are fully aware, they vary in quality, and this is definitely absolutely one of the greatest works of polychromic sculpture that you could hope to see the late 17th century. But if we go to the next slide, what is fascinating, this is a view from that same sculpture from underneath. And here we see behind the scenes, we see how this sculpture was actually made. And it was made with just blocks of timber nailed together, and then the accoutrement, so to speak, all the decorative and indeed arms and legs sort of added on. So this was the structure. So this is very much how Spanish sculptures were made, full-size figures. They were made with this core of timber. Many of you will know that for example, in the German tradition, the German wood sculptures, is a very different sort of method of construction. The figures are normally hollowed out at the back, so that they have the wood doesn't expand and contract and crack and so on. But the Spanish did it very differently, with pieces of wood very carefully put together, and the glass eyes and other details such as often the teeth and the tongue are put in separately from behind. The faces are masked, and all these details are put in from behind. So it is a fascinating insight into how these sculptures worked, and the craftsmanship, the artistry that went into making them. So I think the next slide, I think we go back to you now, Kathy.
Okay. So thank you, Holly. So I'll just, I'm showing you these three images because they're three very different images. We've got a almost life-size Ese Homo in Leon. We've got another small terracotta group, and we've got a relief sculpture, a flat, high relief, but it's about the size of an A4 page, so it's really quite small. And when you look at this work, I just fall in love with it every time I go. There's a kind of a smocking around the wrist of Mary's sleeve, and it is so delicately done. It's quite breathtaking, and the edges of the cloak that the Virgin Mary is wearing, again, you can see this little border of gilt, of gold paint on the really delicate edges, and the implied fringing on this curtain as well behind the Virgin Mary, and the gold paint details around the clouds. Oh, it really is quite a phenomenal piece of work. At the same, it's worth noting that another version of this was bought about a year ago by the Museo de Bellas Artes in Seville. So if you can't get up to Santiago de Compostela, you might be able to see the other version in Seville. So she remained in Madrid with her family for the remainder of her life. She lost another child, which meant that she basically had 2 surviving children. And what's interesting is in this period, she still recalls her time in southern Spain. So you've got echoes of Murillo and echoes of the large works in wood that you see on the left-hand side. She became sculptor to the Royal Chamber of King Charles II about a year after she produced that first little terracotta group that I was talking about before. She retained that title under his successor, King Philip V. Outside the court, she found a patron, the very influential Duque del Infantado. He was one of the wealthiest nobles in Spain. Her ambitions didn't stop there. When she died in January 1706, age 54, on the same day, she received an honor from the Accademia di San Luca in Rome when she presented a relief very similar to this relief here on the right of the Virgo lactans, which is now missing, unfortunately. So she remained an innovator. She remained looking for opportunities throughout the rest of her life. At one stage, she and her husband were both writing to the Pope saying, hey, here we are and we're great and we'd love to donate a wooden sculpture to you. Unfortunately, that never worked out, but certainly the ambition was there and they just kept on pushing. So she was 54 when she died. And I think what I wanted to do in the book was to show her incredibly valuable legacy, not just in her art, but in her personal story, which certainly illustrates how in early modern Spain, a working woman could set a course and follow it until she reached the top of her field. Now, to do that, she would have engaged with a whole lot of people and a whole lot of complications and a whole lot of challenges. But the simple fact is that just looking at these 3 works in front of us in this slide is that she actually did it. She wasn't defeated by the challenges that one would have anticipated she would have faced. So this book is a book that I probably started writing the minute that wonderful lecturer showed me the image of the ecstasy of the Magdalene, because I thought, how come no one knows about this person? People really should know about this person. So hopefully this book allows people to get to know her, gets to know her achievements, and understands her in her historical context. So I'm super grateful to Lund Humphries for giving me the opportunity to present this book with the many beautiful colour images that they allowed me to produce. And I want to particularly thank you, Holly. I want to thank Erica Gaffney and the editorial and the marketing teams for their great support during the production process. And I have to say, I want to thank Holly very, very much for participating with us tonight. I appreciate it very, very much. So thank you. I hope you now have a sense of this woman who we're only just now getting to know.
Thank you, Kathy. I'd like to say thank you to all those people you've mentioned, but to you as well, because I think it's a lovely book, and it's very accessible. That's the thing. It's very scholarly. It's very serious, but it's very very easily written. So very easily read. So I very much applaud what Kathy has achieved after that long journey. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to you both. That was a really interesting discussion and such a great insight into both of your research in the area. Wonderful. We do have a few questions through the Q&A, and if anybody else has any further questions they want to put in, please feel free to do so now. We'll just take a few minutes to go through some of the questions. I guess the first one, Holly mentioned the terracotta Virgin and Child with San Diego of Alcala at the V&A. And this person, Sophie Johnson, asks, are there any other sculptures by Luisa Roldán in the UK art collections that you know of?
Well, I'll answer it, but Kathy, you may have a view as well. There's one or two attributed, but I don't know really how definite the attributions are. I mean, as with all sculpture, but especially Spanish sculpture, documentation and of course style is crucial, and we perhaps are much more careful than other people, as people who've really looked very carefully at Luisa to be a bit chary of making attributions. But I don't know if Kathy would agree with that. Maybe you do know of other pieces that are more secure, but no, I think
no, I don't. The work in the V&A is the only work that I'm very, very comfortable acknowledging as a work by Luisa, and that acknowledgement happened the second I saw it. Basically, it just sings to you, as do many of her terracotta works. Her work in general, as Holly said, a lot of work, Spanish sculpture, has been repainted, repaired. It might have had a bump, it might have fallen, tastes might have changed, so that owners or brotherhoods might say, hey, can we change the color of the clothing? So in fact, unless it's really, 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 really obvious, it can be quite difficult to discern, okay, yes, so we can see that this paint is new, but under the paint, is this Luisa's work? My default position is usually no, and then I try and prove myself wrong, sort of, and build up. Okay, so does it have this aspect? Does it have that aspect? Until I'm at a position where I can say, oh, yeah, of course, there's enough probablys that make me comfortable saying this is a work by Luisa.
I mean, the trouble is, as with other areas of art, it's so tempting to attach a famous name, and she has now become famous. She's a name people conjure with, and so it's very tempting to attach a name to a sculpture, and sometimes it's a bit optimistic. But as you say, you have to. Sometimes you can actually surprise yourself and find that it is indeed a genuine work. Yeah.
Can I ask, and there's another question from Andeli Banta here relating to the authorship. Andeli asks, do we know anything about the makers of the clothing the sculptures wear? Would they have been made in the Roldán workshop, possibly by women? Is there anything you can say on that?
The works that were, the wooden works that were designed to be dressed, often have contracts which say clothing will be supplied, or it will, this figure will wear the robe, blah blah blah. So as far as I know, she didn't ever have anything to do with the fabric clothing that the images have.
And presumably, I mean, I should know this, and I think I vaguely do know it, but things like the glass eyes and, the other sort of additions were often made by specialists who that would then be subcontracted to be added. Yeah.
Kathy, you mentioned that Luisa became a court sculptor to the king. How secure was her work for the court, do we know? And did she receive a steady salary from the court? Was she associated with the court of the Queen Consort at all?
No, she wasn't associated with the court of the Queen. She was specifically sculpted to the royal chamber of King Charles II and King Philip V. Her salary is kind of tricky. The archives that hold what we would now probably say are, the accountant's records are splintered. So you'll find some documents in the Royal Palace in Madrid. So you might find something from the 10th of May, 1694. And then in Simancas, which is a completely different archive, you'll find something from the 11th of May, 1694. So you can say, okay, so that fits with that. And, that sort of demonstrates that it's very likely that she was paid. But you'll get little notes from the king saying, yes, I grant her an extra 25 reales for doing this piece of work. And then 3 months later, in another archive, you'll see that she's written saying, thanks very much, but can you please tell someone where to get the money from with which to pay me? So, yes, officially, she was appointed in October 1692, and she finished work on her death in January 1706. But the receipts that I have been able to find have very large gaps. Now, that's either because documents were destroyed for whatever reason, or have been lost or misfiled, or perhaps that she didn't get paid. So I've got one letter from, I think it's 1700, where she says, can you please pay me the last 3 years in arrears that you owe me? So because we're still in my view, we're still early in the journey of understanding Luisa and finding what we need to find in order to understand her, the conditions under which she lived and worked. all I can do is surmise, but I won't actually definitively say something unless I've got very, very clear evidence that it is so. It's too easy to say, oh, she probably did this or she probably did that. Well, we don't know that she probably did any of these things.
Thank you. We've got a couple questions on the question of style. One is from Mark McDonald, who asks, can either of you comment on the differences or development in the construction techniques between 16th and 17th century polychrome sculpture? And was Roldana's practice significantly new? This might relate to another question from Leopoldine Prosperetti, saying, wonder about the shift of style from tradition of mystery and how that plays to images of private devotion, and asked, does Murillo play a part in this?
Shall I answer the first one of Mark McDonald's question, or at least start to answer it, and Kathy may want to come in on it. I think it's a very good point that Berruguete and Hundahuni and so on didn't, in the 16th century, didn't have the same type of construction. But you do certainly see that type of construction in Luisa's contemporaries and into the early 18th century. I think it might be partly geographical. I think Andalusian techniques may be different from Castilian techniques, but I also think it is chronological. So I think it's an absolutely fair point, and possibly to do with the business of adding extra pieces, and possibly to do with the popularity of dressed images for processional figures, that led to a whole way of dealing with sculpture which wasn't the same as the way you deal with figures on altarpieces, where there's a great ensemble of pieces which have a different role and a different function. But I don't know if Kathy wants to elaborate on that or say anything more, really, or disagree.
No, I think that I can answer the second part if you like. So you're specifically talking about Louisa's shift of style from the large works to the private works. I think that it's the market. I think she moved from a market where large processional floats were customary, and the community was a very close community. It seems as though everybody knew everybody, and the parish priests took a very keen interest in family goings on. You've got their annual census documents in which they make little notes about where someone might have been and why they couldn't have come to communion as often as they might have, and so that's the environment that is fostered in this very, very proud Catholic city. And then she moves to Madrid, which is a court which is full of foreigners, and although Seville was also full of foreigners because there were a lot of traders there, but noble houses were popping up, whereas there weren't so many noble houses in Seville. Diplomats were finding homes in Madrid. Diplomats were decorating their homes. They needed relatively portable objects with which they could decorate their homes. And even today, if you go, I've been very, very lucky in that I've seen some works in private houses that have been in those private houses for a couple of 100 years, and you can visualize exactly how they would have been viewed 350 years ago, because it's pretty much how they're viewed now. And there are these little jewel-like brightly coloured terracotta works in glass cases, usually with a gilt or black wooden base, beautifully carved base. And they're referred to as alhajas, as little jewels, little precious objects. So I think that's the main difference between southern Spain and moving to a court environment, where she didn't have her family reputation to carry her into an established market. She really had to find her own, which I think is amazing when you when you think about it. Strange town, know very few people, and look around and say, okay, how can I make a living here?
Extraordinary. We have an anonymous question, which is kind of a wider question, asking, could you talk a little bit about how the Spanish golden age of art is related to the Spanish presence in the Americas at the time? It's we have quite a few.
Yeah, I don't mind saying a little bit about that, but Kathy may want to again answer it as well. The Spanish presence in the Americas is a very big and very important subject, and Martinez Montañez, who Kathy mentioned earlier on, the very important Seville sculptor of the early 17th century, he did export an altarpiece to Peru. And there are other known exports. There's a possibility, which has never been proved or disproved, that Murillo actually went over to the Americas. There's a gap in his CV, and it was said that he did go to America, but there's no evidence. We don't know either way. And there's certainly works of art from Spain were exported to America, and sometimes people went over to work there, painters, and to a lesser extent sculptors, and they did some extraordinary works. Obviously, this was imperialism, colonialism. This was very much imposing the Catholic iconography, the Catholic view of the world onto Peru and Mexico in particular, and elsewhere in America. So it's a very important part of both Spanish and American art. And one of the things that's fascinating is that the taste for what we have been looking at today, Spanish Baroque art, continued very, very strongly in the Americas well into the 19th century. Neoclassicism simply didn't quite bite in the way that Baroque did. That's what people wanted. So it is a gigantic subject, and many interesting exhibitions and publications have been produced in the last few years. So lots to think about, and lots of reasons to visit and see how Spain relates to Peru, Mexico, Argentina. Yeah. Sorry,
Thank
Kathy.
you.
Yeah.
Kathy, did you want to say anything about the Americas, or?
No, I'm comfortable with what I think, because it's a very large can of worms. A big topic, yeah.
I think maybe just one or two final questions. One's come in asking about specifically about the Met sculptural group, the attribution of the Met sculptural group to Roldán.
Right.
From Mark. Kathy, do you have a view on that one?
Yeah, well, that's one that very often with Luisa, you can see that there's a model of work that she does. So you've got quite a few works with a central Virgin Mary, a kneeling Joseph, an angel that's just flown in, and either a saint or the Christ child, and you can kind of say, oh yeah, that's what she's done, but she's put in an extra image here or deleted that image there. The work in the Met is one of those curveball works that I've recently been coming across, like some new relief sculptures that have been, ones in the Museum of Sculpture in Valladolid, and another one's in Detroit. And they don't seem to conform to a model. So what's interesting about that particular work is that it represents in miniature a very large altarpiece that her father did in Seville in around about 1669, 1670, and which Luisa would definitely have been involved in, because she was, by then she was 17, 18 years old, very clearly very talented. So, and that same image is repeated on the side of one of the floats as well in a little relief. So it's certainly a familiar scene from Luisa's overall oeuvre, but in terms of it being a typical Madrid terracotta, no, it's not. But what I'm finding, to my great joy, is that she does keep throwing me curveballs. You know, I keep seeing things. So the Hispanic Society has got 2 decapitated heads by Luisa, one of St. John the Baptist and one of St. Paul, and they're just breathtakingly beautifully done. But you kind of look at them and you think, hang on, she didn't do decapitated heads, but she clearly did. So that's what I mean about the joy of working with Luisa at this early stage of her art history, is that there's still so much to learn, and I'm sure that we'll find, you know, a companion piece or another work that's very similar to that little terracotta work in the Met. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, I think that gives us a great insight, as has your talk generally, into the sort of research that you've been involved in using the primary sources. It's just fascinating to hear what your process is, and we look forward to hearing more of your discoveries and what's to come. I think it sounds like there'll be more.
Probably.
I think probably that's all that we've got time for today. So I really would just like to thank both of you, Holly Trusted and Kathy Hall van den Elsen, for your fascinating insight into this wonderful lady and her work. And of course, if I just show the next slide, thank you very much. There's our book. Anybody who's interested to find out more, there's loads more in Kathy's wonderful book. And it's the first in our series in Illuminating Women Artists, which we're really delighted to be publishing. So thanks again to everybody for joining us from around the world. And we'll be sending out.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for hosting this.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Lovely.
My pleasure.
Very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.